When we first moved to Malawi, it was an unstable period. The DRC was in huge disarray. Mozambique was finishing up on their own war. Angola was going through theirs. One day, my son, John, I have 3 sons. He's my middle one. He was diagnosed as a juvenile diabetic from the time he was 7 years old, and they almost didn't let us go to Africa because of it. But we really believe that God had called us to Malawi. And today, Malawi's changed considerably. It's still one of the poorest countries in Africa, but it's a long ways from what it was. Back then, there were, I think, 2 gas stations in the entire city of Lilongwe. My son John had become sick a couple of times, and we've almost buried him twice in Africa. He's a man now, 28, doing well. But on this day, John had lost so much muscle mass because he was burning ketones. And we were trying to stabilize him. We'd been trained to stabilize him. We didn't know what else to do. And we knew it was serious. And in those days, you only had planes that came in on certain days. And we couldn't get him out, and it was 2 days' drive to South Africa. And all of a sudden, I remember I was on one part of the city trying to find a way out. So he could be life-flighted possibly. And then all of a sudden, though, where we were staying in our mission house, a medical doctor from Europe called, and Cheryl answered my phone, my wife. And this doctor said, "You don't know who I am, but friends of yours have told me what is happening. Is there any way you can find a way to get John to me? And this is where I'm practicing." And she put him in the back of our Speed the Light vehicle and drove him at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It was precise. And John was so weak because of the muscle mass, he could walk, but not without really good assistance. He was in trouble. He looked like a child that had been malnourished. And Cheryl went around to the other side of the car, got John out, and when she did, 3 men came up with guns, and they came very violent with her, including my son John. And she was begging for his life, and he was begging really for his mom, and wouldn't let go of her until finally she pried John away and said, "John, run, run." And the people in the clinic came out, but there was nothing they could do. There was nothing they could do. And one of them ran and held John, and the men forced Cheryl into the back of the vehicle and abducted her and took off. They were looking to steal the vehicle, but the problem is that in those days, they had had 8 recent abductions with cars in mind. But the problem is that they had killed all of them but one. And Cheryl was in the back of the vehicle with this man holding the gun, and the man in charge driving, and another man driving a vehicle behind them, trying to evade the roadblocks with the police in the different parts of the city. And Cheryl said it was like this black cloud that had just filled this vehicle. And the man was screaming and yelling, and the man in back was violent. And she said, all I could do is prepare myself for the worst, because we knew the stories of what had happened in recent months. And they weren't good. And in the meantime, I had heard the news and was trying to do everything we could, but what do? You're driving around the city, you're trying to intercept. If you intercept, what do? You're powerless. Our Bible school students were praying at the Bible school, and the churches were praying, but outside of that. And Cheryl said all of a sudden, they began to drive in an area she had no concept of where we were. And she said she began to do the only thing she could do, knowing she would not see her children again. And she said, I began to just pray, because she said I was so traumatized, I remember even trying to push my hands down into my lap to try to stabilize my emotions and get some kind of just moment where I was clear. And she said the more I tried, the worse I was. And she said I could realize I was in a state. And she began to just pray the name of Jesus. And she said as I began to pray, she said I didn't realize it, but I was praying out loud in that car the name of Jesus until the man in front stepped on the brakes. And when the cloud dust cleared, he said, "What did you say?" And she said, "Sir, whatever you are going to do with me, I pray you don't forget the name of Jesus." And all of a sudden, he looked at her and said, "You get out of this car. I don't ever want to see your face again. You report us. You tell us who we are. We know where you live. We will kill you and your husband." And she crawled over that man in the back, and they took off, and the car behind them took off. And of course, it went from the worst day of our life to the best day of our life. And John recovered. But the reason I tell you that story is because the days continued like that. And it wasn't romantic. There wasn't music in the background. I didn't say this is going to make a great missionary story. It was earthy. I remember that the elders of this church, the executive elders, came and said, "Maybe you should leave. It's not safe." And they were right. 7 days later, the men hit our compound. One of our missionaries was shot. They came again. And I remember us praying and saying, maybe I should take you guys out. I sat with Cheryl and my son Kevin and John and Mitch. And on the day I was supposed to come back to the officers, I remember coming to them and looking in their eyes and saying, "Are you ready to go? I can take you out if we got to keep you safe." And I remember Cheryl's words to me were exactly this: "There is no way we're leaving this country." And one by one, my sons would look at me, including John, and said, "No way." And I remember walking in that afternoon into this office with these 7 general officers of the Assemblies of God in Malawi, looking to their Bantu faces and saying to them, "Brothers, we're staying. We want to be wise. We want to use discretion, but we feel like, in our case, we're staying." And all of a sudden, tears started flowing down their faces. And they said, in Chichewa, "Now we know how much you love us." And they said, "Why are you staying?" And I said, when you brought us here, we were training men and women to go into very difficult areas. Some of my own students at that time had literally been chased out of villages with their babies in their arms, only to go back to those villages a few months later and start over. And I said, their teacher will not run either. And do you know why we stayed? Not because we're braver than other people. Capacity. You see, and that's what makes the difference for every one of us in this room. It's what allows you to cross your street and speak to your neighbor, put your arm around a coworker. It's what allows you to do what you do. And I don't care if you're a dental hygienist or a construction worker. I don't care if you own your own business. It doesn't matter if you're a school teacher or a student.